I am Karanpreet Kaur from the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, and on behalf of the hosts, BEE, Ministry of Power, SEM and MI Secretariat, and IRENA, I welcome you all to the SEM 14 MI8 High-Level Dialogue on Access to Energy, Accelerating Investments for Empowering Lives and Livelihoods. In the interest of time, we begin with the opening session. May I please request the dignitaries for the opening session to please come up on the dais. Shri Vivek Devangan, CMD, Rural Electrification Corporation Limited. Ms. Gauri Singh, Deputy Director General, IRENA. And Ms. Damilola Ogunbi, CEO, Sustainable Energy for All. May I please request Mr. Devangan to kindly deliver the welcome remarks.
Good afternoon, friends. It's my proud privilege to give welcome address for this session on access to energy, accelerating investments for empowering lives and livelihoods. As you are all aware that Sustainable Development Goal 7 aims to achieve universal access to affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy by the year 2030. A lot of progress has been made to achieve this universal access, but the pace of expansion is slow, with some regions experiencing a rise in people without access to energy. Those areas have already been identified. Mostly it is sub-Saharan African countries where access to energy is really poor, and some portion of Southeast Asia is also there, where we need to give more focus. The lack of investment in energy access jeopardizes not only the SDG 7, but also other closely linked sustainable development goals, especially in the least developed countries and small island developing states. The energy is linked to climate change, poverty eradication, food security, health, gender equality, and job creation. Therefore, reliable and sustainable energy is crucial for agri-food system, enhancing productivity, raising incomes, reducing losses, and improving climate resilience. In the health sector, around 1 billion people rely on health facilities without electricity, which impacts food security. Decentralized renewable energy solutions are promising for bridging the energy access gap and maximizing socioeconomic benefits. We have very distinguished panelists. We are having two panel discussion. We'll hear a lot of about their experiences in respect of decentralized renewable energy. The UAE and IRENA plan to raise about $1 billion for an initiative called Empowering Lives and Livelihoods, Renewable for Climate Action, to connect people and livelihoods and through renewable energy solutions in agri-foods and health value chains. Investments are needed to strengthen the entire energy ecosystem, including policies, planning, capacity building, and innovation. The high-level dialogue, I hope that it will focus on innovative approaches, business models, and government policies to achieve equitable and sustainable energy access and create actionable solutions through the right investment blends. I'm happy to welcome Mrs. Gauri Singh, Deputy Director General, International Renewable Energy Agency, they have done remarkable work with regard to universal access. Thereafter, Ms. Damilola Ogunbi, Chief Executive Officer, Sustainable Energy for All, will deliver the keynote address. I now request Mrs. Gauri Singh to deliver her address. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Devangan. Dear friends, I think it's really a privilege to be speaking to this distinguished audience. And I think very correctly what Mr. Devangan has said about the decentralized renewable energy is it's really a momentum that needs to be built and based on the work that IRENA has been doing on access. We very soon realized that finance is going to be a big challenge in accelerating the pace and the scale of getting the decentralized systems out in the countries that need it. We know, and it's an audience that knows this very well, that access to energy or even SDG 7 has to move beyond just lighting two bulbs, and which is why there is a huge emphasis that we are now seeing coming together on the nexus agenda of energy for livelihoods, energy for empowering lives. And that's a very key area that IRENA is developing our work as we move forward. I do, of course, want to talk about the initiative that Mr. Devangan just spoke about, which is empowering lives and livelihood. But before that, I would like to say that IRENA had taken up a challenge almost 2 years back of raising funds for projects of renewable energy in developing countries, of raising $1 billion for renewable energy projects in developing countries. And at Sharm el-Sheikh, we were able to get together a consortium that came together with a commitment of $1 billion for this. That from Sharm el-Sheikh to now, we've already seen a growing interest of financial institutions to support this, and it's already about $1.5 billion in commitment, and we hope that it will grow as we move to COP28. Those are projects which we feel would be, slightly more utility scale, but in many developing countries, as you would know, that it's not, the expanse of grid is limited. So it's what you can do in terms of injecting into the grid is limited because you need the transmission. So in many countries, we are seeing a mismatch happening between how much generation can be done and injected into the grid, but there's still a big gap in terms of being able to provide access to the many other areas where the grid is not available. And all of us know that there's a huge gestation period when we talk about the grid infrastructure. And it is there that I think the decentralized renewable energy will play a very critical role. We just had a session yesterday at the G20 where it became very clear that business models are there. There's private sector and entrepreneurs who have the ability to scale, but it's finance that's going to be a big challenge. And just taking forward the role that IRENA would like to play closer to the ground with the member countries. We have about 170 countries as our members. And we are very mindful of what they're saying and what, and what we can do about it. So keeping that in mind, we did announce in the beginning of this year at our General Assembly, and it's a huge challenge that we've taken on ourselves of getting $1 billion for productive use of renewable energy and for health. Because those are areas we think that countries really need programmatic support. So it's not a few solar pumps here or doing some 100 primary health centers there and putting rooftop solar on it. But it's about taking a much more transformational view of what needs to be done with decentralized renewable energy. And with the technologies available, with business models in place, finance is a gap, and we've taken on this challenge to take this on. And I hope by COP28, we would be in a position to show some early outcomes for that. But with that, I do want to welcome all of you to this session, which promises to be very exciting. We have a great set of panelists and discussants who will enlighten us about what they're doing in this space. So wishing all of us a very productive session. Thank you.
Hello, everybody, excellencies, honorable ministers, when they get here, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad that it's not just the ministers. I'm actually talking to the people who do the work. And after lunch, I just want you to please bear with me. It's really great to be here giving this keynote, and I obviously have to thank IRENA for putting us together and the dedication that they have to making things work with the fund that they've set up, and now looking to productive use and health, which is very, very close to my heart because that's how I started my career in Nigeria, focusing on primary health care, education, and how that transforms livelihoods as well with things like cold storage. So really, really would like to express again gratitude for IRENA for putting that at the utmost important, while still focusing on the issues of the grid, transmission, distribution, and a lot of the technical issues to make solar work. So we're gathered here today to really talk about the most important issue that we really have, and this is how to really bring renewable energy to livelihoods and have it as a part of what we know as the SDGs. I think sometimes we forget that energy access is a key part of climate change. So without energy access, you are not going to achieve our climate change targets. And this includes things like poverty eradication, food security, health, gender, equality, and job creation. From some of our data, we see that women in the decentralized, especially solar industry, are actually earning the same thing as the men counterparts, which is nice for a change, because women always seem to earn less for doing more work. But more importantly, we have to understand that energy is linked to 2/3 of our SDG targets. So 2/3 of the 169 targets are actually linked to energy and sustainable development. So energy is really seen as, if you think about it in any environment, the enabling environment for the other SDGs to either thrive. If you're talking about health, if you're talking about gender equality, whatever you're talking about, you can link it back to energy. And sometimes that is usually a missing link. It's also not about just, I guess the way I can put it is tier 1 electrification anymore. It's not about just providing people light, it's providing them enough electricity so they go out of poverty. And there's an economic growth story, and I feel that is the message that we're sending out. I've also seen from experience when you go into a lot of these communities, and pardon me, I used to be the head of a rural electrification agency, so communities are everything. It's really important to talk to the communities and ask them what they want instead of you enforcing what you think they need. And one of the things we found when we were there is people were very, very firm with the fact that they need electricity where they work, a lot more than where they live, because they spend anything between 16 to 18 hours a day where they work. Some of them live where they work. So it's really important that anybody, when we're talking about decentralized energy, that I would applaud you to really not plan a lot of these schemes, either in the capitals or even in different countries. Really go and get the data on ground about what these people are actually doing and how they want to manifest. And why it's also important is because the capacity building of the local people for money collections or be the solar installers or the maintenance people can actually be done locally. So even though energy is a very global thing, it's important that it's only done locally. That is where it's implemented. And sometimes we have these amazing plans, and because we haven't put into consideration the local content, or we think it's too hard, a lot of these things fail. And solar and renewable energy is something that we all can't afford to fail. because it's so important, and for many, many millions of people, it is the linkage to life and death. And I think that is how we should look at energy and decentralized energy. Aspect that we sometimes leave behind, or we leave behind a lot, is sustainable cooling. Sustainable cooling affects 1 billion people, especially poor and rural people currently, and they're the high risk of lack of cooling. Heat waves also kill about 12,000 people a year, and the number will just keep on rising. We're looking at about 250,000 people by 2050. We all see with rising temperatures from anywhere you are in the world, you can't really, get away from it now. So when we are planning a lot of our projects, could we also think about the cooling element? And that goes back to what I'm saying about tier 1 electrification. We have to see, even if it's a solar home system deployment, can we include a fan? It is very, very important in terms of the quality of life. But the other thing that is also important when we talk about cooling is cold chains. A lot of us come from developing countries where the food loss from farm to market is almost 40%, because there's not a cold chain system that's able to take that. So we also encourage a lot of mini-grid developers to actually put some cold, basically like a 20-foot cold room as part of their mini-grids, and use that as another business source. We've seen that being very successful in West Africa. The other part I think is important when we talk about decentralized energy. We seem to focus a lot on electrification and don't talk enough about clean cooking. Clean cooking, or the use of fossil for cooking and fuel wood, is easily the 4th largest cause of death of an African woman right now. So apart from that being so horrid, there's also so much gender-based violence linked to going to get fuel wood, bringing fuel wood back, not having food in time for the household, and the average woman smoking 3 packs of cigarettes because she wants to provide food for her family. So it's really, really strange for me in a global world where we've banned smoking, but we think it's okay for women to still use these dirty fuels to basically survive. And this also affects children as well, because they're normally with their parents when they're cooking. So in all this doom and gloom that I have relayed here, one of the great things is that we have all the technology that we need to actually make sure people and everybody on earth has access to adequate electrification. We have all the technology we need to make sure everybody has access to clean cooking. We have the know-how to do energy efficiency, and we know we have to basically make sure it's renewables at all costs. But we don't have the funding, Again, I keep on talking about the African continent because it's important, because the average solar project costs 57% more in Africa than anywhere else around the world. So when people say that, renewables are the cheapest source of power and everything like that, I'm like, it's not a technology play. It is how to actually execute the projects. If you're still borrowing at interest rates of 22%, and if average DFI program still takes 5 years, then you can see that it's not an emergency. So at Sustainable Energy for All, we're very proud to say that we've really been focusing on governments looking at decentralized as a key source, but it's very, very hard to speak to governments and not show them where the investment is coming from. And this is the role we think the G20 could play, being very unapologetic about how much investment they want to put into developing countries, because it's not a nice to have, and it's not just about climate, it's also about development. And putting renewables in the developing countries is how you make sure that nobody is left behind, and how everybody has to live an equitable life. So finally, I think this is the perfect forum to bring governments, businesses, civil societies, technology advisors together to really come together to achieve SDG 7 at the UN. We also have something called the Energy Compacts, which is a pledge and also an action to say that what will I do as a company or a sovereign towards SDG 7 by 2030, that has been very successful in order to keep on pushing the ambition, but we really have to move from ambition to action. So thank you all for listening to me, and look forward to the rest of the event.
Thank you very much, esteemed panelists, for your very enriching talks. This brings us to the close of the opening session. May we have a huge round of applause for our dignitaries. Can I request for a group picture, please? Group picture. Thank you. We now move on to the second segment of our event, the two panel discussions. We have planned two panel discussions here where we bring together the perspectives from all stakeholders across the realm, from the governments, the private sector, development agencies, and think tanks, to give their perspective on access to energy so that we can have a discussion in a coordinated manner and move forward for a coordinated action. May I please invite the panelists for session 1 to please come up on the dais. Shri Vivek Kumar Devangan, who will be moderating the panel discussion. Mr. Devangan is CMD REC Limited. His Excellency Mr. Stefan Wenzel, Honorable State Secretary, Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action, Government of Germany. I believe he'll be joining us shortly. Shri Ajay Tiwari, Additional Secretary, Ministry of Power, Government of India. Dr. Ajay Mathur, Director General, International Solar Alliance. Dr. Jennifer Lakey, Global Director, Energy, World Resources Institute. Srimati Parminder Chopra, Chairman and Managing Director, Power Finance Corporation. Shri Sanjeev Nandan Sahai, Director General, Power Foundation of India. And Mr. Rajesh Miglani, Senior Climate Business Specialist and Climate Anchor, International Finance Corporation. Before we start with the panel discussion, we have with us the chair for our event, Access to Energy. We have amongst us His Excellency, Mr. Samson Gwede Mantashe, the Honorable Minister for Energy, Government of South Africa. May I please request His Excellency, Mr. Mantashe, for his opening remarks as chair. A huge round of applause, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much to all of us. It's quite important to talk about access to energy. It's a befitting topic for us because one of the challenges facing our continent is energy poverty. But what is more important to us is that energy it's a catalyst for economic growth and development. So access to electricity is critical for development. The fact that there is shortage of electricity in the continent of Africa reflects in being the least developed continent in the world. And if we can improve on the access to electricity, we think that will improve on our developmental status as a continent. Our country, for example, comes from a history where access to electricity was based on economic status or population demographics. And since 1994, our government has been making interventions to provide access to previously excluded population. And this is our painful context, hence the topic of energy access is a very critical one in our country. South Africa has steadily increased access to electricity from 34% in 1994. We are at about 90% now. And our intention is to get universal access to electricity. It doesn't go easy because the more we connect, the more pressure is on capacity. And then we begin to experience a number of load shedding, and which impacts negatively on both the economy and social standing of society. We cannot talk about access to electricity without addressing the issue of increasing power generation. That's why we're here. We think that we can increase power generation. And what we always demand is that the debate about access to energy generation should be a candid and open one. For example, it is important to make a distinction between a base load and intermittent supply of energy. It's not the same. The more you load your grid with your renewables, if you don't have storage and you don't have base load, you are heading for a problem. So as you increase your renewables, I'm making this as an issue that can be discussed. You must partner renewables with a reliable base load energy base, whether it is nuclear, whether it is it should be renewable, it should be nuclear or gas. And in South Africa, we've been dependent on coal for a long time. Our energy company was formed in 1923. It is actually 100 years today, and it is heavily dependent on coal. That's why when we talk of that transition, we are not missing the reality that it means we must begin to scale down coal. That's why in the discussion, you will encounter us everywhere. We will not talk about phase out. We'll always talk about phase down, because we want a systematic process of moving slowly out of coal, rather than instant closure of coal power station. However, we believe that energy transition must be done in a just and affordable way, taking into account that each country has national circumstances, and other countries should desist from imposing own transition trajectory on sovereign states. I'm making this point because our experience in dealing with developed economy is that they think that a solution in developed economy will work in underdeveloped economies. Instead of looking into the circumstances of that country and adapt the question of introducing changes based on the experience of that country. I talked of a country that is having 12% of its population having access to electricity. That's Chad in Africa. It's not an exception. It's more a trend. About 600 million citizens in the African continent have no access to electricity. And that is the reality. We don't talk of universal access to electricity as is the case in the EU, for example. In our case, we have poverty of electricity, and that is what we should be talking about. Now, South Africa currently is having to address poor performance of existing power generation capacity. Poor performance of existing power generation assets is creating unfortunate reality of having to implement load reduction measures and to protect power networks. And I think we can learn from developed economies on how to deal with that reality, because they should have met it before us. So we can learn from them. But it is rare to share some of these experiences when we come to forums like this. These measures have devastating effects on the country economy. For example, I'm also responsible for mining in our country. Mining, which is the mainstay of our economy, had a decline in productivity of 9.19%. When we did research, we identified 3 areas. One was electricity and reliability. 2 was logistics that are totally dysfunctional as a result of electricity, and crime of people who want to actually interfere with economic development. And our view is that the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 7, whose objective is to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy by 2030, propels all of us to act in responsible manner while we advance energy transition. So in our various respective countries, South Africa is pursuing SDG 7. We are not doubting that. That's why any debate that we're having has nothing to do with us having an issue with moving from high carbon emission to low carbon emission. We've accepted that unreservedly. But the issue is, how do we travel there? I'm not going to bore you with a long input, but what I can assure you is that we are actually today, 10% of our electricity is from renewables. Now, from nothing, it's now at 10%, and it continues to grow. It's the fastest growth sector in energy. We're also beginning to look into partnering technologies. So South Africa thus welcomes the effort to collaborate on partnership that seeks to increase investment needed to strengthen the whole DRE ecosystem, from policies and planning to building capacity and driving innovation. I'm also keen to learn from the session what our countries are doing in pursuit of energy access. So if we listen carefully, we must be able to learn what other people do, what can we do differently, and that's what attracted me to this session. The question of unlocking investment, especially for developing countries, is crucial if we are to achieve the objective of SDG 7. We encourage multinational financing institutions to tailor their financing packages to suit recipient countries in pursuit of deployment of low carbon emitting technologies. Affordable of such funding packages is crucial for developing countries. Our biggest challenge is the commitment that was made by developed economy in 2020 of $100 billion to fund the transition. That never materialized. That is actually pouring a spanner into the wheels of this initiative of moving fast from high carbon emission to low carbon emission. Development Consent will give 100 billion rand. 2020 comes, 2021 comes, 2022 comes. We're now in 2023. We have not seen it. So that's why in the morning, in the session, I referred to the $8.5 billion that was offered to us to move fast out of coal to renewables. But when we broke it down, very little of that is actually grants, and very little of it is concessional funding. Bigger part is loan, and therefore a loan is not really helping because it sinks your country into debt, and when you're sinking into debt, it is difficult to recover. Because as you grow your debt, you find that your biggest spending in your budget as a developing economy is on repayment of the debt. So those are the realities of life that we must confront. Thank you very much for allowing me to make my comments. I'm going to listen very carefully, learn from all of you. I want to understand things differently, and people must enlighten me to begin to understand what is the journey that we must pursue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Minister, for your very enlightening remarks. We now begin with the first panel discussion. We also have Dr. Ajay Mathur, Director General, International Solar Alliance, here with us as a panelist. May I please request you to join us on the dais? I now hand over to the moderator, Sri Devangan.
Now we open panel discussion 1 on access to energy. The Energy Progress Report, published by IRENA with other custodian agencies for SDG 7 indicators, emphasizes that current efforts and progress are insufficient to meet the 2030 targets for universal access. The International Energy Agency and IRENA scenarios estimate that staying in line with the international climate and energy goals require annual investments in renewable electricity generation and related infrastructure to the tune of about 1.4 to 1.7 trillion US dollar through the year 2030. The lack of investment in energy access delays in achieving the targeted goals for SDGs 7 and derails in enabling other closely linked SDGs with the poorest and most vulnerable communities, especially in the least developed countries and in small island developing states. Now may I invite Dr. Jennifer Laike, Global Director, Energy, World Resource Institute. Because of paucity of time, what we'll do, we'll ask one question from each of the panelists, because we have another panel session after this, and we have to finish this session by 4 o'clock. May I request Dr. Jennifer to respond, how can Ministries of Energy, Agriculture and Health co-invest and bring in investments from the private sector to scale up clean and modern energy solutions, especially for the most deprived women and youth?
Good afternoon, and thank you so much, Honorable Minister, colleagues, friends. It's wonderful to join you today. And I wanted to start my response by recognizing two very critical parts of the agenda: the scale that we're talking about needing to create change, and the momentum in our existing institutions that often drives forward models that are not as innovative, not as subject to local conditions as they need to be. So let me offer a few reflections on this critical moment that we're in terms of changing and delivering at scale against our energy access and equitable development goals. First, we recognize that the risk calculations that have been taken by major international institutions and financial investors has not understood the profile and the approach of the type of investments that we're talking about making. We're not talking about making utility scale investments in the distributed renewable energy space that would be required for healthcare to be transformed at a local level, and or for the agricultural sector, the productive use of renewable energy in agriculture. So in fact, this risk profile, which drives up the interest rates because of the perceptions of risk at the smallest scale, these projects become uneconomical. The second big barrier that we face is this question around the business models that are associated with delivering that technology, and the lack of data and information that allows those business cases to come through, the demand signal to be understood, and the supply side to respond. We do need data. We need audits of these of the businesses in terms of what their demand would be. We need toolkits of the technologies that are replicable and can be deployed multiple times. And we need business planning support. One example of this is in health clinics that we've worked with in Kenya, where we've seen that the health clinics that had put on solar without doing their business plans first had struggled to understand or to take advantage of the fact that they had the solar and they could provide more hours of service for women and children. Where we had support for business planning to help them, the doctors, the nurses, the administrative staff, envisage the type of services they could provide once they had electricity, they were able to expand that clinic, they were able to provide better service, they were able to repay those investments. So we need to recognize that part of the risk and this need for business model innovation requires integration. That means we need to work at the community level, and I think Damilola summed this up beautifully, to recognize how the local institutions can help support those changes. Rural agricultural centers, country and state planning agencies going all the way down to the local in order to help bring forward those business plans, help drive a vision of the accountability for delivering the business plans, and getting that data. WRI has been doing this with our Energy Access Explorer tool, trying to bring that data to life, visualize with a GIS approach where the signatures are, what the needs are, where the local opportunities are for solar and for small-scale mini-grid applications. I'll leave it at that in the interest of time, but thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Dr. Jennifer. We have amongst us His Excellency Stephen Wenzel, Honorable State Secretary, Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action, Government of Germany. Kindly take your place on this dais, please. We have Mr. Sanjeev Nandan Sahay, Director General Power Foundation of India, who has spearheaded the Government of India initiative for village electrification in record time of 987 days against the target given by Honorable Prime Minister of India for 1,000 days. That is 13 days ahead of the targeted timeline. And he had also spearheaded the household electrification, Har Ghar, that is called Saubhagya scheme. That was under this Saubhagya scheme, the household electrification was completed for about 28.6 million households in a record time of 18 months. May I request Mr. Sanjeev Nandan Sahay to kindly share his experience and give us the way forward for universal access to electricity.
Thank you, Vivek. Actually, it was your organization which was the catalyst which did all the work. So first, congratulations to REC, really. We were told in December 14, the government of India decided that all the remaining villages, which is about 18,375, they must be electrified. And a target was given. The scale, I think, is massive. So when we talk of scale, we can see scale here. Money, which is the next requirement, 60% was given as grant by the government of India and 40% had to be mobilized by the state governments through the distribution companies. There were incentives built in for early completion, which could go up to 15%. But what was challenging at that point of time was also the availability of men and material. Because suddenly there was this whole spur in demand for transmission lines, substation, transformers, meters, bulbs. You needed people to string all these, build substations, take them to the villages, and whilst village electrification was on, it was decided in September 17 that all the willing households in the country, they will also be electrified. So whilst the DDU-GJY, which is the village electrification program which was going on, we started on Saubhagya, as Vivek mentioned. And I call him Vivek because we work together, so I take this liberty. We started on this work. And there were huge challenges, absolutely. So first lesson was that there's mission mode. And let me recount a couple of stories in the Northeast. So which are these villages that were left behind really in these 18,000? They're mostly the inaccessible villages or in those states where enough focus had not been made on village electrification. Now in the Northeast or in Leh Ladakh, Kashmir area, these are very difficult terrain. There are places where equipment was taken and dropped by helicopters. There are people who took it on their shoulders, on elephants, over boats, rafts, pulleys, ropes, anything that could be, locally was available. It was crafted and it was taken. Training was required. And there was so much pressure that many, organizations were part of the would check the boxes, but because of strict audit, it came out that wires were strung on poles, wooden poles, which was not accepted. So, in short, what was easy, there's 2-3 things that were necessary. Availability of money, and the government of India went to the market through REC, etc., borrowed money, gave easy finance to the distribution companies, whose remit it was to make these the distribution infrastructure. REC, as a very motivated organization, the entire organization was at it day and night. The state governments and then the central government. It was unified mission mode, and the things that not correct to mention, but I must say there was shortage of material, a lot of production units, the CEOs, the owners, where it was family owned, they were called, they were requested, sometimes rather severely requested. It's an oxymoron, but yes, that all production, that material and their machine lines must be put to producing transformers or electricity lines, wires, etc. But that is what happened, and I think sometime you should see a film, small film that REC has made on Saubhagya. It will show you how difficult it was, but with a clear purpose and intent, we managed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sanjeev Nand Sahaji. We have Dr. Ajay Mathur, Director General, International Solar Alliance, who is spearheading the vision given by our Honorable Prime Minister of India with regard to one sun, one world, one grid. May I ask you, Dr. Mathur, how can the application of innovative technologies such as decentralized renewable energy solutions can accelerate energy access and empower the underserved communities, particularly in remote regions?
Thank you very, very much. I think the first point to note is that you have to have a very strong political messaging, which is what made the Indian connections happen. Together with this is that the availability of electricity, as Mr. Sahai said, makes livelihoods possible. I mean, this is something that Jennifer also mentioned. So, why is this good? Because it enables jobs which never existed earlier. It enables lower pollution. It enables the country to, instead of importing fuel, to have local fuels. Now, innovative technologies are amazingly important. In India, we used a methodology which actually, essentially, I mean, there was some standalone solar, but it was largely extending the grid. When we look at the global picture, there are about 900 million people who don't have access to electricity. With grid extension, we did the numbers at the rate at which occurs, the monies that are available and so on. It can at best cater to about 30% of these. You will still have 660 million people in 2030. And 2030 is the year when we had hoped that the entire world would be connected to electricity. So 660 million would still be without electricity. How do we do those? And that's where Mr. Dibangan's suggestion of innovative technologies comes in. One of the things that we are looking at is solar mini-grids. Solar mini-grids, as the Honorable Minister said, they're expensive, and consequently, if the country has to borrow, it clearly doesn't have the capacity. Therefore, can we make regulations which invite the private sector to invest in solar mini-grids, and what the state does is therefore pay for the electricity? That is possible. This has happened in many, many countries. Is it available here? Yes, it is. And we expect that if you've got 660 million people, approximately 60% of them can get electricity through solar mini-grids. And solar mini-grids can be scaled up as time goes by. The challenge is what is the rate at which you provide electricity to people. There is a political compulsion to provide electricity to households at prices which are no more than what urban consumers pay. But there is a possibility of a higher price for commercial consumers, because what do commercial consumers do, or they do now? They use diesel. And diesel electricity is expensive. Solar electricity plus batteries costs at least half, if not even less than that, of what diesel electricity does. Consequently, there is an opportunity for mini-grid operators to charge commercial consumers somewhere in between these two prices, and therefore ensure that there is willingness to pay on the behalf of the consumer, the commercial consumer, and there is an adequate return which ensures that they are able to process their own investments. However, solar mini-grids still will only work where there are densities of population. If the densities of population are less than 400 people per square kilometer, then we are looking really at standalone grids, standalone systems. Standalone systems would, we believe, be needed for at least 40% of the 660 million people we are talking about. In other words, there'll be a mixture of grid, there'll be solar mini-grids will be another part of the mixture, so solar standalone systems will be a third part of the mixture. That's the only way that we can ensure that everybody in the world has access to electricity by 2030. It's doable, but we will need to get our houses in order.
Thank you, Dr. Ajay Mathur, for enlightening us with your considered views. May I now invite His Excellency Stefan Wenzel, Honorable State Secretary, Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action, Government of Germany. May I ask you what kind of public-private partnership have helped to provide and enhance public services like health and education with improved energy access across Asia and Africa?
Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. And I think energy access is a very important point, and we should highlight it even at G20 and at the COP28, because we have with energy access one of the 17 goals of the Sustainable Development Goals, which were decided about in 2015 from the United Nations. And it has, and now we now have a lot of new technological possibilities you talked about also, because in the moment sometimes there were diesel electric solutions, and they are much more expensive than using a mini-grid with solar. With a mini-grid with solar, we can reach regions that never had a grid. Because a grid powered with a big power plant or whatever, coal, gas or others, was in the whole system much more expensive than implementing a solar mini-grid today. And that there must be find good solutions to highlight it on the international conferences, to look together for good finance system, and also for a framework, for an incentive which supports it in the local village, because it's. I think it's also, if you have the access to the energy, you have so much more possibilities. Not only you can charge your handy, that's the first thing, what's easy, but you have a lot of new jobs creating there, handcrafting, cooling possibilities to save vegetables or whatever, that find so much advantages, and on the same way you have a possibility for clean cooking too. There are advantages, and so I think we must much more highlight it on the international conferences and speak about special implementation financial services to reach all these countries and all these regions of the countries which not have already 100% access to electricity.
Thank you, HE, Mr. Stephen Evanson.
One idea
Yeah.
more, maybe, because it's discussed at the G20 summit tomorrow, but also at the COP28. We're talking about the goal. In the moment, we have about 350 gigawatt of new power plants all over the world, in all countries all over the world, and about 80% are already renewables. And now we discuss the goal to triple this, to build every year 1 terawatt new renewables. And that would be helpful also because if we talk about that, we have on the same item we have to talk about energy access. And that would be helpful to support that at the summit here tomorrow and at the COP28 too.
Thank you so much. We have Mrs. Parminder Chopra, Director Finance, Power Finance Corporation, with additional charge of Chairman and Managing Director of Power Finance Corporation Limited. May I ask Mrs. Parminder Chopra, how can access to affordable and tailored financing instruments be improved to support renewable energy applications across sectors? What role can the Ministry of Finance and other banking and non-banking financial institutions can play, and how the government can reduce their burden to promote green finance?
Good evening, everyone. With focus on energy transition all around the globe, the goal is now to provide clean and green energy. To fund this energy transition, I think on each of the forums there has been a lot of discussions that how the funding can be provided. And everybody wants to understand how the sustainable financing can be made available to meet the SDG goal. The governments, especially if we talk in the developing nation, can't bear the burden alone. So, private sector investment needs to be channelized here. For this, but we need to address their concerns and provide them with the sufficient incentives. And importantly, the funding solutions adopted need to be for the longer run, on a sustainable basis and not as a one-time solution. For this, I would like to share my few thoughts with you on how we can leverage the available sources to the maximum extent. One possible approach could be to provide the blended financing. For this, we can have a nationwide some nodal agency that can collaborate with government and other institutional contributors for equity investment. This equity can be sought from climate financing agencies, multilateral agencies, sovereign wealth fund, and other financial institutions. This can be blended with the commercial funding from market. To make rising market debt more attractive, the governments can step into with the support and with a minimal financial burden. This can be done by offering of the government guarantees for raising of the commercial loans, allocating low-cost funds to this new fund, perhaps labeling it for the priority sector. And this being a social cause, I think directing some percentage of the corporate social responsibility funding that can be channelized. If I talk in India, the size of the annual CSR funds are to the tune of 3 to 4 billion. So even 10% funding for providing the interest subvention could be a game changer. In parallel, we can also consider for creating a government-backed crowdfunding platform. So, generally, the concerns on this crowdfunding is about the usage. But with the government backing, we can address the usage and make it more effective. By pooling these sources, we can make available funds at a more competitive cost than what it is currently available. Through innovating financing solution, we can leverage the maximum available resources and that can create a multiplier effect and amplify the positive outcome of universal energy access. And I think we can collectively do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Parminder Chopra, for invoking the collective wisdom and the collective efforts for universal access to electricity. We have distinguished panelist Mr. Rajesh Miglani, Senior Climate Business Specialist and Climate Anchor, South Asia International Finance Corporation. Mr. Miglani, may I ask you, in carrying out Universal Energy Access Program, how can government manage financial burdens? What policies and mechanisms could increase the possible sources of funding, both locally and internationally, public and private? And what would be the share or contribution from the various stakeholders involved?
Thank you very much. Before I talk about the possible ways to unlock the capital from the government perspective, just want to let you know that the World Bank Group, including IFC, we just concluded our inaugural set of country climate development reports, CCDRs, for 24 countries, and it's in the public domain. And CCDRs are essentially the diagnostic tool which examines the linkage between the development and the climate agenda and aims to inform government, citizens, development partners, and enable engagement on this particular topic. These are essentially report, and in one section of the CCDR report, we have pretty much captured the key short-term, medium-term, and long-term recommendations to unlock capital for the government, and highlighted the changes which is required in terms of the institution and policy reform. So it's very much there. So the key message which is emanating out of the CCDR is, as our panelists also said, that the public money is really scarce, right? And the countries which are grappling right now with high debt to GDP ratios, high inflation, there is no choice but to look out for the private sector capital, yeah? And here are my 4 suggestions. Of course, you can have a look at the CCDR, but the key messages which I just want to share with the audience in terms of unlocking capital from the government perspective are, number 1, I would say, we have to enable the PPP environment. So which means you have to swiftly act and establish a PPP unit and equip them with the right expertise for the project identification and work with the line ministries for the project procurement. And the perfect example for this is where Zambia, Senegal, Uzbekistan are working with IFC's Scaling Solar Program, and we have delivered 1 gigawatt of renewable energy through PPP, and under 1 gigawatt is under preparation again for African countries. So this has really worked out. And the secret sauce for this success was the standardization. Standardization means in terms of contractual terms, in terms of financial modeling, in terms of all important terms and consideration. I think the standardization really worked for this. Second, I would suggest we have to really strengthen our domestic financial institution. As one of the panelists rightly said, we have to provide the incentives to the local financial institutions to look into this universal energy kind of access kind of projects, which means you have to have priority sector lending. You have to include these type of projects under priority sector lending. You have to have different risk weight for these type of projects versus fossil type of projects. You have to have enabling environment and reduce the regulatory cholesterol, I would say, by creating risk sharing, credit enhancement, and blended finance, as you rightly said. That kind of environment has to come from the top. And microfinance institutions also have to be brought into this play. And what government can do, encourage them to show them the right product. So instead of open burning cook stove, of course these are energy efficient cook stoves, and I've been hearing about them for the last 15 years. Why not, induction stoves, which could fall under the category of white goods, and microfinance institutions would be more keen. Third, I would say the carbon finance ecosystem. And carbon finance after COP26, I think, is really picking up, and there's a traction from the carbon neutral companies to really look into buying from. And these are charismatic credits, for these, the solar pumps you say, or all these projects. So what I would recommend government to come out with a national rollout of say, induction stoves alongside solar mini-grid. Because solar mini-grid, as Dr. Mathur said, there would be some, impediments from the investors. But if you blend alongside this national induction program, and the feedback which I got, it's pretty much working in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, Laos, induction stoves are really working well. So why not club this and do a national rollout by inviting 5 global firms to participate? And of course, you have to do a lot of upstream work. It's not that easy, but this can be worked out. And finally, I would suggest government to come up with a universal energy access pipeline dashboard. We have a very good dashboard in India maintained by Invest India on the infrastructure pipeline. On the similar basis, if government can come up with the universal energy access pipeline dashboard for investors like us, where we can see, following the 3S principle, the size, the safe, and the simple one, the standardization. I think if these 4 simple points can be looked into by the government, probably we can move the needle towards achieving the universal energy access. Thanks.
Thank you all the distinguished panelists for such a productive and enlightening session. At the end of this panel session, we are 100% sure that we'll be able to achieve Sustainable Development Goal 7 to achieve the universal access to affordable, reliable and sustainable energy by 2030. Thank you all. Thank you so much. May I request all the panelists for a group photograph.
Thank you, esteemed panelists. A big round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. We now move on to the second panel discussion on investments in renewable energy for agri-food and health. May I invite the panelists for the panel discussion 2 to kindly come up on the dais. The session moderator will be Ms. Gauri Singh, Deputy Director General, IRENA. The esteemed panelists for the session are Dr. Arunabha Ghosh, CEO, Council on Energy, Environment and Water, CEEW. Mr. Ravindra Dolare, President, Ecozen Solutions. Mr. Ashwin Pavade, co-founder, S4S Technologies. Mr. William Brent, CMO, Husk Power Systems. Mr. Amit Jain, Country Manager, NG. Ms. Luisa Matos, CPO and CIO, Clean Watts. And Mr. Praveer Sinha, CEO and Managing Director, Tata Power. May I request everybody to kindly be seated? I now hand over to the moderator, Ms. Gauri Singh.
Where the private sector. So good afternoon and welcome to the second panel, because this is where you will hear from the private sector what kind of business models exist, what are the kind of financing solutions we'd like to see in the distributed renewable energy to upscale the pace of deploying distributed renewable energy in our countries. With that, let me get the discussion started and first turn to Arunabha, who just yesterday launched a very important decentralized renewable energy compendium along with the Ministry of Renewable Energy. And my question to you, Arunabha, is that we all saw the case studies that you've done across 27 countries, but if you were to talk about insights, the key insights on financing which have worked, I think we'll all really gain from those insights.
Thank you, Ms. Singh, and thank you to IRENA and, of course, to our hosts for this session. Let's get straight to the point. In the previous panel, we heard about this huge push for household electrification that India had. And if you convert the 28.6 million households that were connected to electricity in 18 months, basically what that meant was about 2,200 households were getting connected every hour, and about 4.5, 5 people per household. That's basically about 11,000 human beings who got access to electricity every hour over 18 months. Now, if you look at the number of people who don't have access to electricity, about the 700 million people, and the 7 years we have to get to 2030, and you do the back calculation, it effectively means that we have to get power to 11,500 people every hour for 7 years. So we have to do what India did in an intensive way over 18 months, and we have to do that globally over 7 years. So this 45 minutes that we'll spend, about 8,000 more people across the world should have got electricity. Otherwise, the run rate in cricketing terms keeps going up. Now, as Dr. Mathur also explained, then there is one part of it which will be the grid-connected push. And then there is the grid interactive decentralized energy, and then there's the pure off-grid decentralized energy. In the report that we published yesterday as part of an official G20 study report, we at CEW looked at cases across more than 24 countries, about 30 cases, on how distributed renewables can bring access to electricity to people. But the question is not the different types of technology and business models that are out there. The question is, how do we get finance flowing in very innovative ways? So let me just very quickly outline for you some of those ideas. Number one, how do we leverage microfinance institutions? One of the things that we see is that while microfinance institutions might be there in many developing countries, what matters is not the cost of debt, but actually the tenure of debt. So our research at CEW shows that for loan tenures of less than 5 years, increasing it just by 1 year significantly improves the ability of these decentralized renewable energy entrepreneurs to repay the microfinance institutions. So how do we then help these last mile delivery institutions to get the support from the limited amount of public capital in order to be able to extend the debt tenures by a few more years. That's number one. The second most important mechanism we saw was the subsidized interest rates. Now in India, for instance, we see there's a solar looms mission, solar charkha mission. There's the Prime Minister's credit scheme for power loom weavers, etc. The point is, can we use schemes such as these to leverage the access to credit-linked financial assistance for solar-powered productive enterprises, particularly in the small, basic textiles, garment sector, again, which we see across the developing countries. This allows for, as Damilola also mentioned earlier, the place of work to get the power rather than the place of sleep, even though the place of sleep might be very close to the place of work. That becomes important. Third mechanism from an end user perspective is that the pay-as-you-go model allows for better orientation of the loan design to be designed alongside the kind of revenues that the households and the small enterprises have. So that staggered loan collection methods, actually, along with technology-enabled platforms, allows us to bring the digitalization story and the decarbonization and decentralization story much closer to the households and the enterprises. Fourth, the risk mitigation measures. We heard a little bit about this from the Power Finance Corporation. How we use first loss default guarantees with support of philanthropic foundations, multilateral development banks, and of course public finance from the home countries to deploy productive use applications, particularly in rural or farming sectors, for instance, solar irrigation. Fifth idea, revolving funds. How do we use the targeted funding support and then replenish this through a results-based financing framework where rural credit banks or small industries development banks can create this pool of funds. You pay out, once you're done, you take the payback and reinvest it in the next geography. And again, the catalytic role that philanthropic institutions can play becomes important. And finally, of course, the role of non-banking financial institutions, crowdfunding platform, venture capital and angel investments, especially in exploring the use of distributed renewables for livelihoods. So the point here is it's not either or. It's not just grid versus off-grid or grid versus decentralized. It's how do you play a complementary role. But unless you put the household, the small enterprise, the person at the center, we'll have this big gap between our policy pronouncements and ambition at one end and the actual deal flow and the actual volume of investment that flows on the ground. We at CEW in the last 2.5 years with our partners Wilgrow used a capital fund of $3 million and managed to get power to enterprises, enabled more than 11,000 productive use applications with 17,000 livelihoods enabled, 72% of the beneficiaries being women. If we could do that as a small experiment as nonprofits and social enterprise accelerators, it's very much possible that the power or the collective that we have in this room and in this building can be leveraged with that ambition in mind. 11,500 human beings have to get access to electricity every year for the remainder of this decade. That's the ambition. There should be accountability against that ambition.
Thanks, Arunbha. I think it's really set the tone for this discussion, and we heard from the South African minister earlier that, while getting the fund flow for doing this is important, but so is the cost of capital, and we have to look at innovative ways of getting also the other actors, some of them already available in the country and some outside, involved in this huge endeavor that we have to take. It's not a small endeavor that we are looking at. And because we have some very interesting panelists who will bring out their entrepreneurial journey and their challenges, let me invite Mr. Ravindra Dolare, who's the president of EcoZen Solutions, to talk a little bit about his journey and what are the challenges he's facing as he moves towards sustainable cooling and in the agri-food zone.
Thank you very much. So we at Ecozen work in agri-food ecosystem with different solutions like decentralized solar cold rooms and solar water pumps. We have deployed this technology in India, Africa, as well as in Southeast Asia. However, while developing these technologies and working very close to the consumer, we have realized that there are many opportunities and hurdles into the entire ecosystem. And I will keep my thoughts very relevant to what we have experienced in last 10 years across different continents, and what kind of investment, financing, hurdles are there, opportunities are there, and how can entire ecosystem will support here to scale such technologies. So while working with different communities in India like farmers, farmer producer organizations, because we work very closely in agri-food ecosystem, we realized that right financing instruments are not available at this point of time into the ecosystem. When it comes to financing, from consumer point of view, they talk about affordable financing. And a lot of initiatives still need to be taken. So there are few ideas which we have tried on the ground to unlock this potential. And along with innovation, there was another talk in the last panel as well, the innovation in business model. And that is where it is very much required at this stage, not only innovative technologies, but also innovation into the business models. So one of the model that we tried and tested here in India as well as outside is pay-as-you-go model. And we realized that the initial cost of these DRE solutions from consumer point of view is a bit high, and how this can be made affordable to them. And the models like pay-as-you-go that definitely have a good impact, and it make this type of technologies accessible and affordable to the community. Along with that, there are few instruments which are supportive into the ecosystem, that is subsidies and incentives. Even though they are not very well attractive because of complexity in the processes, but whatever subsidies and incentives are available, that gives kind of relief initially to adopt these technologies in different countries. One point highlighted by earlier speaker as well, one of the great initiatives taken in India at this point of time is subsidized interest rate. And like agri-infrastructure fund, which is currently very well practiced in India, this type of initiatives are actually supporting the DRE solutions like us to penetrate well to the end user and make these technologies accessible. However, we have very different experience in Africa. We have worked in both Eastern and Western African countries. And what we realized that there the electricity is a big challenge. There is no access to electricity. And these technologies has to be very well accessible to the community. A few challenges we faced initially were the import duties and taxation rates are very high in these countries, and this makes these technologies completely unaffordable. So there, the collaboration between grant funding organizations, the financial institutions, and what is working for us very well is pay-as-you-go model into these countries. So, like investments are additionally needed to strengthen the whole ecosystem here, from policies to the capacity buildings. However, a collaborative approach like discussed in earlier panel discussion as well, that coming together the government policies, the financial institutions, and few innovations from DRE sector will definitely strengthen and overcome challenges that we are facing currently. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I've just been told that we'll probably need to, have the next session in about 15 minutes. But so I would, I think all of us here would like to hear all the panelists, and so if we can just keep our replies, keeping that in mind. About we have about 10-15 minutes left. William, I know that you've You've been giving some fantastic offers to countries who are willing to take it about getting mini grids based on biomass in. And I think it's important for the audience to hear what are the real challenges you're facing in being able to scale up with the biomass DRE.
Yeah, thanks, Gauri. So just to clarify, our mini grids that we build are primarily solar plus batteries, although some biomass gasification is also part of it. My answer will be more from an industry perspective than from the perspective of Husk Power. So I've been coming to many of these conferences for several years now, and with all due respect, none of the financial mechanisms that you're talking about that CEW has identified, they're not new, right? We've known about them for a long time. We've been talking about them for a long time. There's not a lot of innovation required from a financing perspective to actually mobilize the money that's needed. The reality is that the organizations that are supposed to be de-risking technologies like ours are not doing their job. They're not doing their job in the sense that they're not taking the risk. They're not doing their job in terms of deploying money fast enough. And they're also not doing their job in terms of pooling their capital. And they're creating an ecosystem which is impossible for companies like us to navigate in an efficient way. So I'm just going to keep it that simple. I think those are the things that need to be done. People need to do their job. The financing mechanisms are there. They just need to do it in a more efficient, efficient way, human resource efficient way, and actually deploy the capital that's there in a way that we already know how to do. Thanks.
No, thanks, William. I think that's really putting the ball very straight, and and I think it's a point well made. Let me turn to Mr. Ashwin Pawade, who's the co-founder of S4S Technologies, and get your views out, because I know you're also working in the agri-food sector. So maybe you also have seen how financing works or doesn't work, and it's good to get your views on that.
Thank you. Most of my points are covered by Ravindra. So because we are in the same segment, just to add to the points he made, we started to avail the finance from the NBFCs and microfinance, but the rates are exorbitantly high. And that's why we have to shift to banks. And banks were not very welcoming, typically the PSU sector banks. So, and we have to make the point, first we did the pilots along with various grants, foundations and government help. And once it is settled, then we again went back to the banks along with some of the proposals like having their risk covered with some of the mechanisms like interest subvention or subsidized schemes from various banks. And when we gave this proposal to them, they were welcoming, and we started working along with them, especially with the RRBs, which are typically neglected for the financing part for the DRE in a district level segments. And they are meant for that. The rural regional bank, who are especially the priority sector lending, they have to lend. They have the mandate, but the typical NPAs are so high that they are reluctant. So we did a tri-party agreement with bank, the beneficiary and us, that we will take care of the EMIs. And whenever the processing is not happening, because typically the food processing is a seasonal thing. In our case, we are into food processing of dehydrated products. So we have developed solar energy based systems which works on the renewable energy, solar energy, and dehydrate the food products like various vegetables, and these dehydrated products we sell to various markets. So to buy these dehydration machines, this financing mechanism we developed along with these RRBs, especially RRBs. So there, the scheme by NABARD, AIF, as Ravindra mentioned, helped us a lot, 3% interest subvention. Then there is specific scheme of PMFME, Prime Minister Formalization of Micro Food Processing Industries. It gave back-end subsidy of 35%, but that was a comfort zone for banks, that almost 35% of their lending is covered by bank. So this kind of mechanism, if we can club in, it will be very helpful. Third thing, just if, as I mentioned, that there is seasonality in food processing, especially when we are using the renewable energy-based solutions. So our processing units are shut down in the monsoons for almost 3 months. And in this period, we have to pay the EMI on behalf of our beneficiaries. So we are taking the toll on our working capital. But because it's a small, we are working along with 2,500 women as of now, this is possible. But if we can make some kind of moratorium for 3 months or delayed payment or delayed EMIs, especially for the beneficiaries, especially rural women. So this kind of innovative things which might not be very feasible from a standard banking point of view, but if this could be done, this will be very beneficial for the propagation of DRE in the rural segment. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashwin. I think it's a tough job being an entrepreneur, getting your solutions on the ground, getting the output from the farmers, but also arranging for EMIs and doing that kind of backup. So I think it really exemplifies what kind of challenges entrepreneurs in this space face. Let me bring in Ms. Luisa Matos from Clean Watts and get her quick insights into what your challenges have been in this space.
Thank you. So at Clean Watts, we are focusing on building energy communities. And to do this, we are combining digital technology with energy as a service and access to capital. And the part of the access to capital, we still have a couple of barriers if we want to scale this kind of business models that, by the way, are offering savings for end consumers from 20 to 30% lower cost on energy. We have been deploying communities, and we started with a program that was 100 villages addressing energy poverty at rural areas in Portugal. And in these cases, we know that we can't ask people to invest themselves in the PV plants. So what we do, we go and access the funding to private investors, but we have some barriers, some problems. One is the size of the project. So we are not talking about grid scale projects. And some of these infra funds, they look at really big projects. Then we have, when we look at each small community, we have the risk factor. Because even if we are creating a vehicle that will fund these projects, we'll have to put, for instance, a solar PV in a rooftop of a company or an entity there. And our investors, they want to check the risk of that company that is there. And that's another barrier that we have. So there is also uncertainty in terms of permitting. How fast can we actually have the permitting to start building and then selling that energy? So that's another barrier that is not helping when we are talking with bigger investments. Then we have this dual kind of investors. So we are looking at these infra funds that usually they come in when you already built the power plant, and we have the need for the working capital, because they come in when everything is already established and you are already able to build that energy for the community. So we have this problem, so the short-term access to the funding. So some of the suggestions that we would like to share here is to match actually these problems and see how we can combine some public support in some of these schemes that can help de-risk the investment and help us to accelerate the access to this kind of capital. So if we think about having like short-term public funding for the working capital, for instance, where we can actually then reuse this capital to build more and more and more communities. So this will help us to bring faster projects that are ready to be funded by bigger infra funds. So this is a suggestion, and also having the public support to take or de-risk the risk component of where we are actually building our power plants. So combining these two elements, I believe we can actually accelerate the growth of distributed renewables through local energy communities kind of projects.
No, thanks so much, Luisa. I think, the role of public sector and how it can leverage private sector funding or at least de-risk some of the work that you're doing is definitely going to be important. And as we are drawing to a close to this panel, let me bring in Mr. Pillai into the conversation at India Smart Grid Forum, I think you have seen and interacted with a large number of players and you know what the challenges are, and I think all of us would benefit from hearing about them.
Thank you very much. And this is energy access is something which is very close to my heart and could go on for hours or days to talk about it. But in the next 1 or 2 minutes, let me just talk about the new approach for that. So going back, I mean, we've been doing rural electrification from 1969 or something, but hundreds of thousands of villages were electrified. In 2003, Government of India defined the rural electrification in a different way. The original definition was one bulb. Just one bulb in a village was rural electrification. We changed that to 10% of the household should be electrified, all public institutions should be electrified. And that new program, when it was launched in 2003, Gujarat had about 17,000 plus villages which were not electrified. And the then Chief Minister of Gujarat, our present Honorable Prime Minister, he didn't accept that definition. He said, I want 100% villages to be electrified. Not only that, 100% of the villages to be given, the households to be given 24/7 electricity. They redesigned the program and segregated the feeder. The feeder which goes to the housing area of the village was given 24/7 electricity, and the one which goes to the farm area were given electricity for 8 hours from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. So additional money for doing that was given by Gujarat government, and the 17,000 villages were electrified in a new way where all the houses were electrified. They were given 24/7 electricity. And many of the benefits which were actually perceived or thought about came in. Household income goes up because the day gets longer. 4 or 5 hours of extra hours people could do income generating activities. Children could study, all those things. Medical facilities came to the village. Vaccines and medicine could be kept in freezer. The investigation centers like X-ray, scanning, those things came to the... So people need not go to the nearest town to do simple things. And similarly, telecommunication. People could charge their mobile phone at home. Otherwise, they had to go to a different place to get it charged through diesel generating set or something. And photocopying centers, many other things, television, entertainment, all those things came. Repair shops, welding shops, all those things came in the village life changed. 2 years down the line, an impact assessment study was done by IIM and IRMA, 2 independent institutions. All this were achieved more than estimated at the beginning of the project, like household income went more than 30% in that 2 years. But one particular point which touched everybody's heart is the dropout rate of female students from school came down by 85%. Why? Because the girl students are pulled out from school to fetch drinking water from faraway places. And with 24/7 electricity, people invested in pumping stations, and drinking water was made available in the village right there. And that changed the entire villages in few years. That's a major socio-economic change which happened. And that was close to Prime Minister's heart. That's what exactly he is doing. As you heard in the previous session through Saubhagya, we connected almost all household, 99.9% of the household to the grid. If you ask, do they get 24/7 electricity? No, that's the next challenge, which we are hopeful that we can do through new technologies. So today, 20 years down the line, we don't need to segregate the feeder. There are digital technologies, new technologies in which we could achieve that. The project which Lucia mentioned about local energy communities, the local energy communities, part of them prosumers generating clean energy and sharing or trading with their peers on a blockchain platform in such communities, and the entire local community grid offering flexibility to the bigger grid is something which is a very unique thing which her company has done and demonstrated in 3 different geographies, in Portugal, in Finland and in UK. And that we have a session on that tomorrow, 10:45, local energy communities, 10:45 to 12:15 in the same room. And her project is being recognized an hour later in the award ceremony, and Clean Watts won the first award, prize for, I am announcing it an hour earlier. It's a very, very, all the juries, I chair the jury panel for ISGAN. a honor which I've been doing for the last 5 years for the International Smart Grid Action Network. And all the juries, we have an international jury panel of 6 of them, all of them selected her project as first, which happened first time. And otherwise I used to conduct 3 or 4 jury meetings to come out with the highest marking. And 4 projects we are recognizing an hour from now in the main ballroom. Please come. I won't go, we have to stop it here. There are many new technologies we are in the forefront of new technologies being tried in the country, and 24/7 before 2030 in all the households in India will be possible. And those business models can be replicated in other developing countries as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think, the insights that we've all gained, one thing definitely is for sure, that with access to electricity and also brings in development and consequences that you didn't even think, like having a dropout rate of the girl child go down in the schools by 85%. So I think this is also a call that we'd like to make from IRENA as we build the campaign for empowering lives and livelihood and getting $1 billion for decentralized electricity, for productive use, for health and education, that it has to be part of the adaptation finance, and adaptation finance and development finance cannot be 2 different things. Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you, esteemed panelists. This brings us to the end of our high-level dialogue on access to energy. A huge round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. May I request you for a group picture, please? Thank you. Thank you, audience, for your attention.